What happens when one of Britain's most revered actors walks into what should have been a routine morning television interview, only to find himself face to face with a host seemingly determined to dismantle him? In barely half a minute, a simple question about his latest film would unravel into one of the most astonishing live television meltdowns ever witnessed, revealing the darker side of daytime TV and leaving viewers across the country stunned. Anthony Hopkins settled into the bright studio chair, adjusting his tie with the easy confidence of a man who had conquered Hollywood many times over. The legendary actor, known for embodying some of cinema's most complex characters, arrived expecting a cordial conversation about his upcoming thriller. What he encountered instead was a challenge unlike anything he had prepared for. Across from him, Lorraine Kelly flashed the familiar morning show smile that millions had grown to trust. But something was different. Her expression held an edge, too sharp, too practiced. Beneath the polished warmth was a tension that Anthony sensed immediately, though he could not yet decipher its cause. "So, Anthony," she began, her pleasant Scottish lilt flowing across the studio, "tell us about this new film of yours. I have to say, watching the trailer, I couldn't help wondering whether you might be getting a bit too old for these action roles." The question hit the air like a toxin. Anthony's eyebrows rose, a faint flicker of surprise crossing his distinguished features. He had endured decades of interviews, probing questions, harsh critiques, even the occasional personal jab, but the tone of Lorraine's remark carried something unusually venomous. "Well, Lorraine," he said evenly, "I believe age brings experience and experience brings depth. I don't see myself as too old. I see myself as seasoned." Her smile widened, but the warmth evaporated. It was no longer the smile of a welcoming host, but of a predator who had discovered new prey. "Seasoned, perhaps. But surely you know audiences want fresh faces now. Younger energy. Don't you think it's a bit desperate? Holding on to roles when maybe it's time to step aside for the next generation?" The camera caught the subtle tightening of Anthony's jaw. This was not the easy promotional stop his publicist had arranged. It was an ambush disguised as morning television. "I wouldn't call it clinging," he said, still calm but with unmistakable steel in his tone. "I'd call it passion for the craft. Something I suspect you might not fully understand, given your background." The remark was subtle, but the impact wasn't. Lorraine's eyes flashed, her practiced farce aids slipping for the first time. The genial daytime personality vanished, replaced by something icier, harder. "My background," she laughed, though the sound was brittle. "At least I didn't have to play a cannibal to get people's attention. Some of us built our careers on talent, not shock value." The studio temperature seemed to drop. Mentioning Hannibal Lecter was one thing, dismissing the performance that earned Anthony worldwide acclaim was another. To reduce it to cheap sensationalism was not just insulting, it was absurd. "Shock value?" Anthony repeated, his voice sinking into that chilling register audiences knew all too well. "Is that what you think acting is? Exploring human nature, creating characters that endure? That's just shock value to you?" Lorraine leaned closer, sensing she had struck a nerve and pressing forward with the eagerness of someone who wanted the fallout. "Oh, come now, Anthony. Don't be so sensitive. We all know that role was you simply hamming it up, playing to the cheap seats. Real actors don't need theatrics." The words were delivered casually, almost lightly, but the cruelty was precise and deliberate. To imply that one of cinema's most meticulously crafted performances was mere showmanship was either staggeringly ignorant or intentionally malicious. Anthony's hands, resting quietly on his knees moments before, curled into slow, deliberate fists. His gaze hardened. His voice dropped again. "Theatrics," he whispered. "No, you want to talk about theatrics." In that moment, the air in the studio seemed to thicken. Viewers would later describe the shift as palpable, an almost electric tension signaling that the interview had crossed a line from uncomfortable to unforgettable. The next 10 minutes would leave producers scrambling, the network reeling, and the internet exploding. But it all began with that single, whispered word. "What would you call this little performance of yours?" Anthony asked, his voice low and edged with disappointment rather than anger. "Because this isn't journalism, Lorraine. It isn't even entertainment. It's cruelty dressed up in television lights." The studio fell into a suffocating silence. The hum of the cameras suddenly felt louder, sharper, almost intrusive. Even the normally chatty production assistants, who lived for behind the scene's gossip, had fallen completely still. They watched with wide eyes, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips, witnessing a televised implosion no one could have predicted. Lorraine's smile wavered for a single heartbeat before snapping back into place, brittle and practiced. Cruelty, she repeated, her voice laced with false innocence. I'm simply asking the questions viewers at home are thinking. Isn't it time you admitted that your best days are behind you? That maybe, just maybe, you're holding on to something that's already slipped away. Her words were crafted to pierce the ego of any aging actor, the kind of jab meant to find old insecurities and pry them open. But Anthony Hopkins was not the sort of man easily dismantled. He had survived storms far darker than a hostile morning host. Addiction, self-destruction, reinvention. He had stared down his own shadows and lived to build a legacy on the other side. My best days, Anthony said slowly, rising from his chair with deliberate dignity, are the days I choose to define as my best, not the days some failed television presenter decides to judge from her little morning show throne. The blow landed with perfect precision. Lorraine's face went pale, then flushed a furious red, as though she had been struck. The words failed television presenter cut deeper than anything else had, a reference to the difficult, uneven years at the start of her career, moments she had tried very hard to bury beneath decades of on-air polish. Failed, she sputtered, her voice cracking like thin ice. Failed. I've been on television longer than most people have been alive. I've interviewed prime ministers, celebrities, royalty. Who are you to call me failed? Anthony now towered over her, the contrast between his calm stature and her unraveling composure painfully obvious. You've interviewed them, yes, he replied. But have you ever actually listened? Or were you too busy planning your next cruel little dig? The cameras were still rolling, capturing the confrontation in unforgiving high definition. Across Britain, viewers leaned closer to their screens. Some grabbed their phones, recording the chaos, already aware they were watching something that would echo across social media, workplace conversations, and news headlines for years to come. Lorraine jolted to her feet, her chair spinning behind her like an abandoned prop. How dare you? How dare you come on my show in my studio and talk to me like that? She jabbed a finger toward him. You think because you won some awards decades ago that you can treat people however you want. Awards I won. Anthony shot back, voice rising with a controlled thunder. Because I respect the craft. Because I treat my colleagues with professionalism. Because I understand that being on television is a privilege, not a license to tear people down for ratings. The words dropped between them like a gauntlet thrown in an ancient duel. Lorraine's fury hardened her features until she barely resembled the friendly presenter viewers knew so well. Her hands shook, whether from rage or adrenaline, no one could say, and the harsh studio lights deepened every tense line in her face. Privilege, she hissed, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. You want to talk about privilege? You, with your Hollywood money and your Hollywood attitude. You think you can waltz in here and lecture me about television? I built this show from nothing. I earned my place here, day after day, while you were off playing dress-up in movies. The accusation was petty, desperate, born less from confidence and more from a woman feeling her control slipping through her fingers. And everyone watching, both inside the studio and across the country, could see it. Something irreversible had happened. The veneer of polite morning television had shattered, leaving nothing but raw ego, wounded pride, and two titans locked in a battle neither had intended to fight that morning. And the cameras captured every second. It was the kind of attack that revealed far more about the attacker than the target. Playing dress up, as if decades of masterful performances, decades of giving life to complicated, unforgettable characters, decades of moving audiences to tears, laughter, awe, and terror, could be reduced to something so childish. The insult wasn't merely unprofessional, it was embarrassingly small. Anthony's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, one sharp, electric moment, everyone in the studio suddenly understood why he had been so compelling as Hannibal Lecter. There was something predatory in his stillness, something coiled and dangerous in the quiet way he held himself. It wasn't rage. It was control, a kind of mastery that made the air feel heavier. Playing dress up, he repeated softly, the gentleness of his voice amplifying the fury beneath it. Is that what you think I do? What we do? He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. You sit here in your little bubble, reading words off a teleprompter that someone else wrote for you, asking questions other people research for you, and you have the audacity to mock the craft of acting. Lorraine stepped toward him, closing the space between them with the confidence of someone used to dominating a studio. Most guests would have backed away. Most guests did. But Anthony Hopkins was not most guests. He had played kings and monsters, heroes and demons, men unraveling and men rising. He had conquered stages and screens across continents. A morning talk show host trying to intimidate him was almost laughably insignificant. "At least I'm real," she shouted, her voice bouncing off the studio walls. "At least I don't hide behind characters and scripts. I face the world as myself, not cowering behind some made-up personality." It was an attack designed to wound, a blow aimed at the heart of every actor's vulnerability, the suggestion that acting was somehow less authentic than real life. That performers were copycats rather than creators, that they were hiding behind masks because they lacked something essential. It was cruel, it was ignorant, and it was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Anthony's response was quiet, controlled, and devastating. "You think hiding behind a television persona, behind a script you didn't write, behind a format designed to protect you, makes you more real than someone who has spent a lifetime exploring the depths of human emotion?" He leaned in, but his voice never rose. It didn't need to. "You've never been more wrong about anything in your life." The camera operators scrambled, adjusting their angles, desperate to capture the tension unfolding mere feet away. This wasn't just good television anymore. This was history in the making. A moment that would be replayed, dissected, and mimed for years. No one in that studio would forget what they were seeing. Human emotion. Lorraine barked, forcing a laugh though it came out sharp, brittle, desperate. "You mean the kind of emotion where you pretend to eat people? Where you play monsters and psychopaths? That's your idea of exploring humanity?" She was clinging to Hannibal Lecter again, reaching for the one jab she thought she could land. But what she failed to understand was that Anthony wasn't ashamed of that performance. He honored it. The role had not diminished him. It had defined him. "Those characters," Anthony said, his voice growing quieter, more intense, "those so-called monsters and psychopaths, they represent the shadow side of human nature." He stepped closer still, and no one dared move. "They reflect the parts of ourselves we fear, the parts we deny, the parts we pretend don't exist." His words landed like thunder wrapped in silk. "Portraying them requires more courage, more honesty, more real emotion than anything you've ever done in your safe little studio." Lorraine's face twisted, the mask of professionalism she'd worn all morning crumbling piece by piece. She had started this interview believing she could dominate an aging actor, reduce him to a stammering, defensive mess for the entertainment of her audience. She thought she controlled the narrative, the room, the interview, but she had badly miscalculated. Anthony Hopkins was not a man easily cornered, and Lorraine Kelly was not nearly as powerful as she believed. Instead of dismantling Anthony Hopkins, Lorraine herself was being systematically unmade, unraveled piece by piece by a master of his craft who refused to be bullied. She had expected compliance. She had expected defensiveness. She had expected an old man too polite or too wary to push back. Instead, she had walked straight into a storm she had no ability to control. "Safe little studio," she screamed, her voice cracking with outrage. "This is live television. Anything could happen. There's no director to call cut, no second take if I mess up. This is real pressure, real stakes." Anthony actually smiled then, a cold, mirthless smile that flickered across his face like a shadow. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't humor. It was disbelief at the absurdity of her comparison, at her complete misunderstanding of the world outside her cushioned bubble. "Real pressure?" he repeated, almost tasting the words. "You want to talk about real pressure?" He leaned forward slightly. "Try performing King Lear in front of 2,000 people. Knowing every breath you take will be judged by critics who know Shakespeare as intimately as their own pulse. Try carrying a $100 million film on your shoulders, knowing hundreds of people are relying on you to succeed. That's pressure, Lorraine. What you're doing right now is just throwing a tantrum on live television." The brutality of the comparison was undeniable. Whatever stress Lorraine faced within her carefully insulated morning show routine paled beside the decades of artistic, financial, and emotional burdens Hopkins had shouldered. The audience, who had been frozen silent, began to murmur, the sound rising like distant thunder. They had come expecting soft questions and polite laughter. Instead, they were witnessing their host unravel before their eyes. Some reached for their phones. Others simply watched, stunned, unable to look away from the catastrophe unfolding. Lorraine's breathing grew loud and uneven. Even under the studio lighting, her makeup began to betray her, creasing at the corners of her eyes, cracking around her mouth as her composure splintered. She had cornered herself with her own attacks, and now she thrashed like an animal trapped by its own aggression. "You think you're so superior?" she spat, the venom in her voice unmistakable. "You think because you're Anthony Hopkins, because you have an Oscar, because Hollywood worships you, you can stand here and humiliate me on my own show, my studio, my rules." The possessiveness poured out of her uncontrollably. My show, my studio, my rules. It was no longer about journalism or entertainment. It was about territory, about dominance, about the fear of losing control in a space she believed she owned. Anthony remained still, eerily still, letting her fury wash over him like rain sliding off stone. When she finally stopped, panting slightly, the silence that followed was suffocating. Then, in that unmistakable voice that had commanded theaters and cinemas across the world, he spoke. "Your show," he said softly. "Your studio, your rules." He paused, letting the words settle. "And yet with all that power, all that control, the best you can do is tear down someone who came here in good faith to talk about their work." He tilted his head, studying her. "What does that say about you, Lorraine? About who you really are when the cameras are rolling?" The question hit like a blade. It wasn't merely an attack on her professionalism. It was a challenge to her integrity, to her moral center, and the way her face twisted, almost collapsing inward, proved he had struck the nerve she'd spent years trying to bury. "How dare you question who I am?" she screamed, voice rising to a shrill pitch that made several crew members wince. "I've done this job for 20 years. I've helped people. I've brought joy to millions of homes. I've made a difference." But even she seemed to hear the hollowness in her own words. The warmth and kindness she claimed were nowhere to be found. In their place stood a furious, vindictive figure feeding on conflict like oxygen. Anthony shook his head slowly, and for the first time, there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "You want to know the difference between us, Lorraine?" he said quietly. "When I play a villain, when I portray someone dark and twisted, I'm exploring a character. I'm trying to understand what makes them tick." He held her gaze, unflinching. "You don't need to explore cruelty. You just are cruel." The words struck with the force of a hammer, clean, undeniable, and devastating. There was no raised voice, no theatrics, no embellishment. Just a simple statement spoken with such clarity that it cut through the chaos like a blade. Lorraine recoiled as if physically hit. Her breath hitched, her shoulders jerking back, while her face drained of color under the unforgiving studio lights. Makeup that had been flawless minutes earlier now emphasized the pallor beneath, revealing the tremor in her jaw. Of all the accusations Anthony Hopkins could have lobbed at her, this was the one she hadn't been prepared for. Question her professionalism, she'd laugh that off. Question her intelligence, she could spin that. But question her character, question the very core of who she believed herself to be, that hit a place she could not defend. "I am not cruel," she shrieked. The pitch of her denial betrayed her immediately. It was too sharp, too hysterical, too desperate. "I am not the villain here. You are. You came on my show with your arrogance, your condescension, your Hollywood superiority complex. You made me do this." The flailing attempt to shift blame was both immediate and utterly transparent. Each word she threw sounded wild, scattered, as though she were trying to grab onto any scrap of justification before she completely unraveled. She had started the hostilities, escalated every exchange, pushed every boundary. Now, unable to contain the consequences of her own behavior, she was frantically rewriting the story mid-broadcast, painting herself as the aggrieved victim in a drama she had authored. Anthony's response was calm, so calm it made the contrast almost painful. "I made you do this," he repeated as though genuinely contemplating the absurdity. "I made you attack my age, my craft, my career. I forced you to try to humiliate me in front of your own audience." He shook his head slowly. "No, Lorraine, that was all you. Your choice, your character, your decision to be small and petty and, yes, cruel." He adjusted his jacket with the practiced ease of a man long accustomed to maintaining dignity under pressure. The gesture alone made it clear he was preparing to leave, that he had given her more time and patience than she deserved. Panic flashed in her eyes. She wasn't ready for him to walk away. She needed the last word, needed something to salvage the power slipping rapidly through her fingers. So she called upon the one tactic she thought might still work. She went for the insult meant to pierce the deepest. "Fine, leave then," she spat, Run away like the coward you are. Prove to everyone watching that the great Anthony Hopkins can't handle a simple interview. Can't handle being challenged by a real journalist asking real questions. It was her last desperate gambit, the verbal equivalent of throwing herself across the tracks to stop a departing train. She hoped to bait him, trap him, force him to stay and keep engaging on her terms. But Anthony Hopkins had weathered critics, directors' egos, and industries far harsher than this. He did not rise to petty provocation, not when the moment demanded dignity, real questions. He echoed, and his quiet contempt silenced what little audience murmur still lingered. Is that what you call character assassination and professional jealousy? He turned his gaze directly to the camera, commanding it with the skill of a lifelong performer. I came here to talk about my work, to connect with people who might enjoy the film I've made. Instead, I found someone so threatened by actual talent that she felt the need to tear me down. He let the words settle, each one weighted, deliberate, unignorable. That says everything about her, he continued, and nothing about me. With that, he turned and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed across the suddenly cavernous studio, each one marking the slow unraveling of the show, the host, and the illusion she had so carefully constructed around herself for 2 decades. Lorraine remained frozen in place, staring after him as though watching her career drift out the door with him. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of her collapse, every flicker of disbelief, every tremor, every fragment of a persona crumbling in real time. The audience looked on in stunned silence, witnessing the moment Britain's beloved morning host revealed something far darker beneath the polished smile. The moment when the mask finally shattered.